No. Okay. Oh, really? They took up two spaces? They took up two? Okay, I'll let the parking know. You started recording? Okay, that's okay. That's fine. I do the same thing here. I start this way early, just in case. And then when I go tomorrow to trim it, I gotta trim like 10 minutes off of it. Same thing. I don't know. I haven't heard from him. He's been running late, usually. When I came, something in the park. Something happened in the park. Oh. Oh, there he is.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your patience. I'd like to call to order the Planning Commission meeting of today, Thursday, November 2nd, 2017. This is a regular Planning Commission meeting. And I'd like to call on David Eichmann to come lead us in the flag salute. If you would, please. Thank you.
Hand over your heart. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We should make an announcement. There's a silver BMW in the parking garage. Somebody's issue with that. I don't think it's anybody's here. We should make an announcement.
Okay. Before I go on to the roll call, apparently there's a silver Mercedes, a BMW in the parking lot on the first floor that's apparently in two spaces and not properly parked. If that belongs to anybody here, would you go take care of it? Thank you. Yeah. Okay. May we have the roll call, David?
Good evening. Commissioner Hoopengarner,
Present.
Commissioner Carvalero, Commissioner Bass.
Here.
Commissioner Elchel.
Here.
Commissioner Guy.
Here.
Vice Chair Jones.
Here.
Chair Buckner.
Here.
And we have a quorum.
Thank you so much. Item number 4 is the approval of the agenda. Do I have a motion?
I'll second.
Commissioner Elcho?
I thought I did.
Thank you. Agenda passes unanimous.
Thank you. The next item is item number 5, in which we normally would have approval of minutes, but we have been asked to continue the meeting, those minutes to the next meeting, which is Thursday, November 16th, for the approval of the commission.
I'll move it.
We have a motion and a second on that. Thank you.
And that passes unanimous.
At this time, it's public comment. Do we have some speakers?
Yes. First public speaker will be Stephanie Harker.
Parker? You come forward, be sure to state your city of residence and your name, even though we do know who you are. Halloween's over, huh?
Good evening, Commissioners, Chair Buckner, members of the public, and staff. On the slip that I filled out to speak tonight, there's a box you check off. I have concerns regarding, dash. My main concern about the city that I have made my home for 33 years, remembering that we were founded on basis of economic survival, is that we are becoming what we were against. The east side did need cleaning up, still does. What we got were luxury condos, luxury housing, 1,000 units in 5 blocks, more traffic, more homelessness. And I went to the well-produced opening of Avalon Bay. Yes, the apartments are beautiful. Can anyone who resides in this city now, particularly under rent stabilization, afford any of them? No. What my fear is they're going to sit empty primarily, even though we were told as by rote, every single person that we ran into that night, oh, we're 80% leased. And I finally joked with the young man and I said, so you lease these to people who don't have any furniture? Because they were all basically empty and darkened, except those that were staged. And again, they're beautiful, if you like modern. But the studio, 541 square feet, rents for $2,950, plus your utilities, including water. The water is not paid there, so you're paying your water, your gas. So it's well over $3,000 by the time you're done. You get 1 parking space with that. If there are 2 people living together, which happens frequently in our society, as we well know, and there are 2 cars, you can have a second parking space for $150 a month. If you have a guest come and stay with you, that's $25 a car overnight. What happened to our economic survival? I think right now, for so many of us, the only recourse is to move away, and many of us don't wish to do that. So I really hope that in the future, as planning goes along, that we somehow manage to entice the developers to build us some workforce housing, some middle-class housing. The 2-bedroom apartment at the Avalon Bay and the Domain and the Dillon and the Huxley are over $5,000. I don't know about the rest of them with their utilities and things. I don't know if they're paid, but pretty rich for economic survival. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Do we have any other speakers?
One more, Michael Wokalej.
Good evening, Commissioners, staff, members of the public. My name is Michael Wojtkiewicz. I am from the city of hypocrisy, overdevelopment, the city which is become what it once stood against. And there is great irony that this Planning Commission meeting falls on today's date, November 2nd, where the President of the U.S. unveiled his tax plan. And so far, the reviews are the same old, same old. Massive treats for the rich and confusing tricks for the rest of us. And this is exactly what the city of West Hollywood does. It puts out these little beautiful binded copies, whether it's called the East Side Community Priorities Plan or Miss Savage's Aging in Place Plan. And these things talk about quality of life, open space, more recreational facilities. It talks about community gardens. And here we are, 2 days past the closure of the only community garden that was remaining. There were 3 people from the public who came out to speak on the East Side Community Priorities Plan. City Council, all 5 members seemed to love it. I actually objected to staff's recommendation because it's a fairy tale. If you believe in what the East Side public has spoken about, you need to think carefully as this meeting goes further tonight, because what's on the agenda goes against this. What is on the agenda adds to a number of units that is already 2.5 times the estimate that was given when the city issued a 30-year redevelopment plan for the East Side. They speculated 420 new units, 500 rehab units. We're over 1,000 new units, and if anyone wonders why the East Side of Hayworth is seen as the East Side, that's probably because Hayworth House that had 42 rehab units exists, because that's pretty much the only building that has been rehabbed. So the number that should account for 500 is dwarfed. It doesn't even come close. So if you believe in this, then vote accordingly.
Thank you.
That was our last public speaker.
Thank you. Public speaking period time is over. If you are out there and want to take a speaker slip at the end of our regular meeting, at the end there's an item of public comment, and we welcome you to do that. Director's report, number 7.
Good evening, Chair and members of the Commission. John Kehoe, Interim Director for Community Development. 2 things. On Monday night, the cannabis ordinance is going to the City Council, so you'll want to pay attention to that because that's a really big item that's going to go to Council, and there'll be lots of changes as cannabis becomes a fact of life. So it'll be important for you to pay attention to the City Council action on the cannabis ordinance next Monday. And then also on Monday night was also the boards and commissions meeting, and where they gave out street names for people who have been on a commission for 15 years or longer and are currently on the commission. And unfortunately, John Altschul wasn't at the commission, so here's his street sign that he was unable to pick up on Monday night, and I will go up and present it to him tonight.
Thank you.
John Halshaw Street.
Street.
Yes.
And that's all I have. So.
Going to rename our street. Thank you very much. At this time, do we have any items from commissioners? Anybody want to speak at this time? Okay, then we'll move on. There's nothing on the consent calendar, so we'll go on to number 10, which is our public hearing. We have one public hearing tonight, 1201 through 1207 North Detroit Street. And I believe, Lori Yelton, you're going to be speaking on this issue with the staff report. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Good evening, Commissioners. Tonight before you is a request to construct a new 4-story, 10-unit multifamily condominium building over on-grade parking on 2 adjacent parcels that are both currently vacant at 1201 and 1207 North Detroit Street. The proposed project will not incorporate any affordable housing units within the project and instead pay the in lieu affordable housing fee. The applicant also requests a modification for a 10% reduction in the front yard setback. The corner property at 1201 North Detroit is currently a community garden, and the adjacent lot at 1207 North Detroit previously had 3 dwelling units, which were recently declared a public nuisance by the Community Development Department and was given notice to abate and remove the structures immediately. The Sheriff Department received approximately 90 phone calls regarding transients vandalizing and taking over the dwellings at 1201 Detroit and causing a nuisance to nearby residents within the last year. The Building and Safety Division declared the property to be unsafe and a public nuisance and gave notice to abate and remove the structures on the property, which can be found in Attachment G of the staff report. The applicant diligently worked with code compliance and building and safety divisions to have the building secured multiple times and ultimately issued an early demolition permit to remove the dwelling units on the property. The buildings constituted a hazard to public health, safety, and welfare and were declared unsafe. The entire property was uninhabitable, and traditional means of keeping transients out of the buildings were proven unsuccessful. Therefore, all of the dwelling units have been demolished and both lots are currently vacant. While the applicant originally applied for a demolition permit, these intervening events eliminated the need for a demolition permit from the planning department, and that part of the request has since been withdrawn. The proposed multifamily building has been carefully designed and articulated. As such, staff has deemed the building to be of exemplary design, as it is uniquely three-dimensional and addresses the corner lot with openness and interest, and will be a positive addition to the corner of Detroit and Lexington. The applicant requests a modification to reduce the front yard setback by 10% from the required 18 feet 3 inches to 16 feet 5 inches. Staff supports the front yard setback modification request as the building is located on a corner parcel and the building adjacent to the subject property to the north is a 20-unit multifamily building with a 14.97-foot front yard setback. The average of the front yard setbacks on this block of North Detroit Street is approximately 15.95 feet, so the modification request will allow the front yard setback to be in line with other buildings on this block. The project provides 90 green building points, which have been reviewed by a building and safety plan check engineer and will be more thoroughly reviewed in its entirety once the complete set of plans, including structural plans, are submitted to building and safety during the plan check process. The green building points may shift during this process, but the project has been conditioned to have a minimum of 90 green building points. Overall, the proposed project meets the general plan goals and the multifamily standards, is well-suited for the subject site, is thoughtfully designed, and is complementary to the context of the neighborhood. Therefore, staff recommends approval of this project. I would like to add the following condition, condition 1.10, which reads, per section 19.48.060 of the West Hollywood Municipal Code, dwelling units within the city are intended for long-term occupancy as reflected by the definition of dwelling units in section 19.90.020. As such, no part of any dwelling unit in the project may be used as corporate housing or in violation of the city's short-term rental ordinance. Lastly, staff received an email from a neighborhood watch captain on the east side in support of the proposed project late this afternoon and believes the project should have a fence and gate around the property because of the high level of transients in the area. Staff also received an additional email this afternoon in support of the project from a nearby business owner in support of the project, which was also provided to you earlier. That concludes my presentation, and staff and the applicant and architect are available for any questions you may have.
Thank you. Before we go to the applicant and give him an opportunity, her, an opportunity to address the commission, are there any questions that any commissioners have or disclosures that you want to make? Questions of staff or disclosures?
I would like to disclose that I spoke with the applicant and discussed items contained in the staff report.
Thank you. Any others?
I have a question.
Question of staff?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you explain your understanding of what an extensive green roof is In the staff report, you outline that this has an extensive green roof, yet the applicant in their green points refers to an intensive green roof. So my understanding of these two things is perhaps not what your understanding is, so I'd like to have your explanation.
Excuse me. Are you saying extensive or expensive?
Extensive versus intensive green roofs.
I believe it should be extensive green roof, and the applicant's architect is available to answer that question.
So your definition of an extensive green roof?
It's identified in the plans, and the applicant can answer that
Well,
question.
perhaps when you come forward, then you can address that. Thank you. Any other questions? And Commissioner, be sure to let us know if your question's been full answered to your understanding and satisfaction when she comes forward.
Into the microphone, Susan.
Okay. I guess the rest of my questions I can direct to the architect as well as staff, so it doesn't matter.
Okay. In that case, then, we're going to ask the applicant to come forward. As usual, you'll have 10 minutes to address the commission, and then we'll have members from the audience, if there's people who want to speak to this item, to come forward, and then you'll have a rebuttal after that. If you don't use all of your time, you can use it at the end, okay?
Okay. Thank you, commissioners. My name is Andrea Keller, and I'm the architect for this project. Can you put on the slide with the 3D view?
With the
The 3D view? The 3D, sorry, the 3D and the site plan. It was your second slide, I believe. The starting point of this project is it is a corner site, and it is, or the one before that, that has just the render? That one, perfect. This is one of the first views that you get of the east side of West Hollywood as you turn off of La Brea, and we felt very strongly that this should serve as a gateway and a step in between the large buildings on La Brea and the R3B buildings on Formosa. So this is a step between. There is a community garden on the site, but I did want to clarify that it was not owned by the city and was never owned by the city. This was a private property that had been given over, so it's not taking back a community garden. The tenants did get to serve their term, and the term was in fact extended. We did very seriously, though, think about the amount of green in the project, and that was really a starting point. We started this project under the assistance and direction of Stephanie Reich, and during that time, we talked a lot about not creating a box, about breaking a box, and also about incorporating landscape at all levels of the project. We wanted to, in a way, take apart what had been that garden and give it back. The palette is meant to be very natural with the use of wood and light tones and simple and serene. The idea for the building mass is that each living space has a frame around it, and this frame also has a passive solar benefit in that it's shading the glass. We wanted to literally break the box and to kind of frame these living spaces and make them feel more intimate and also change the scale down to something that was more easily understandable. In terms of the green points, that was also something that we take very seriously. So we have calculated a passive heating cooling system. We have stair towers that bring the hot air out. There's no carpet, we're using concrete slab floors, and we could go into detail about that, but we've worked out very carefully how we would achieve that. That was important to us. Lynn, it is an extensive roof, so it should reflect that on the application. We have a large amount of planting on the roof, and it surrounds the roof decks. And the idea was also for the privacy of the neighbors. We didn't want the rooftop occupants to be visible from the street, and we wanted the neighbors to have privacy. So by containing people in the middle, so we've taken that garden and put it on the top, and I do think there's a softening effect when you look at the building from afar. The other thing that we did in early steps is we took the stair towers, because this is R3C, which allows us to do 45 feet. The stair towers then went up into 54 feet. and that was really too tall. So we actually removed the top of the stair towers, and it's at the 4th level. So you go outside a floor below, and there is no projection. So that was one of the early changes that we made as we worked with staff. In terms of the setback, the neighboring building is 15 feet from the street, and it is 100 feet wide. And the one beyond that is then 200 feet from the corner. So by taking the average, and that one's being demolished and currently redeveloped, by taking the average and then asking for 10%, that would still put us about 1.5 feet further back than the adjacent property. So that was our rationale, is we're still further back, but that it would be visually compatible with the neighboring block. Concerning the fences, I did speak to Commissioner Bass about this. We had originally come in with a 42-inch fence, and that had been our design intent. We changed this when we went to the neighborhood meeting. We had several meetings with the neighborhood, and they were very concerned about security and asked that we put in a 6-foot fence. And Stephanie Reich had also suggested benches, and the neighbors were very terrified by the idea of benches and who might be on the benches. So accordingly, we raised it, but we had a 42-inch solid wall and then an open lattice above to provide the visual contact but still have some security. The applicant we always did start with a 42-inch fence, and that was the original design intent, so we're open to the commission's suggestions on that. This was in response to the neighborhood, and it was surprisingly something that many of them felt very passionately about. So we were only trying to be a good neighbor and work with them. In terms of the unit sizes, we do have 4 of these units that are 1-bedroom. So the idea was someone who works at home and trying to provide a diversity in unit types. The front units also could have an elevator if someone moved in and wanted to. There's space to do that. So we wanted to have, give kind of a different type of project. The building, as you can see, is actually 3 blocks, and the blocks are connected up above the 3rd floor. So we've tried to remove pieces as much as we could. Thank you.
Would you remain there in case there's some questions from commissioners at this time? Any questions at this time?
Yes. So back to the extensive versus intensive green roof. My understanding of an extensive green roof, which staff has in the report, is that it's in fact like the Chicago City Hall. It's 2 to 3 inches of soil covering the entire roof, low plantings, there is no pedestrian traffic. So in your green points calculation, you are saying that it's an intensive green roof, and you've added 2 points for that. But an intensive green roof involves plantings, trees, et cetera, and has certain minimums. I don't see anything on this particular plan that is any different than any of the plans we've looked at in other roofs. They're just some planters with some plants in them. So I'm curious as to if there's something we're missing here in terms of the intensive green roof that's going to be provided?
It is not an intensive. It should be extensive. So it should not say intensive on your report, so.
But then how is it an extensive green roof?
Well, extensive in the amount of planting. So we did calculate the total square footage of planting, and it's between 12 and 18 inches deep, so we can have significant growth. This isn't just a couple inches of soil.
Okay, but then it's not an extensive green roof. Extensive green roofs look like a Norwegian shed where everything is green and growing. So that's not an extensive green roof. Chicago City Hall, the entire roof is plantings. That's an extensive green roof.
Okay. Now, my understanding was we had to hit a certain square footage of planting, so I can check on that.
The points were just, it's part of the green points, which affect this whole calculation and the open space, so to me, it merits conversation.
Absolutely, and we understand that the green points would also be vetted in plan check as everything is refined and we know exactly what materials are being used, how much, the composition of the concrete and all of these things.
Okay. On page A10, you indicate the 21st parking space is actually outside and in the rear setback. And yet, on pages A6, A2, A2.5, that space isn't there. I'm concerned because it is part of the 21 spaces required, and also that space is in front of the trash bins, so I'm not sure how the trash trucks will get the bins out if someone's parked in that space. And in addition, it creates an additional apron on the sidewalk, which takes away the street parking. So it removes a public street parking space to give a private space in a yard area when the code says that all the parking should be in the interior of the building.
I actually believe that we've resolved this, and that the curb cut is existing, so that has always been a driveway in that location. There's no taking away, and we had talked about putting a guest parking there, but I believe that now we're adequately parked inside the building and don't need that space. So we did have...
Where's the 21st space?
So I believe because we have 4 one-bedroom units, that brought down the count. So we have we have 2 guest parking spaces between the building volumes on the ground floor in the parking court. So there are 2 guest spaces.
So then the third one, you're going to eliminate the one over here?
Yes.
and the-
We're adequately parked within the footprint.
So, but your cover sheet says there's 21 spaces.
Well, we reduced the unit count subsequent to that. I mean, we had a 2-bedroom unit that we turned into a 1-bedroom unit, or we did that 2 times to bring our parking count down.
So the bedroom counts and the parking counts are different than presented?
Than in our staff report, is that correct?
No, I believe that they're accurate. We did do a lot of work on this in the past couple of weeks, so, but I believe that
On page
21st
A0.1, it's 12 spaces plus 6 spaces plus 3.
20 is the final count, is what we need.
But on A25, there's fewer.
You require 20 spaces?
Yes,
21.
20, I believe.
Okay. I count 20,
It is 20.
not including
But
that.
the calcs on the cover page are 21. Required.
There's 20?
On page A0.1.
No, A25. So that...
No, I
we
mean,
remember that
yes,
these-
in the interior of the building, there are 20 spaces, but the actual calculations in the zoning section says that the requirement is 21.
Yeah, that is correct, 21
Oh, it
spaces.
is 21, okay, so we do need that
We'll-
space.
We'll work
Okay.
on that.
So you may want to add a condition to make sure that we get it correct at the
Well,
end.
my concern about that is that the space as it's outlined is blocking the trash, it's in an exterior space, which is not permitted per the code. It's problematic in terms of the design, and I'm not sure where you would fit another space in this current design.
Okay. Yeah, we had only thought of that because of the existing curb cut, and that was in fact a driveway for the original residents on the site before it became a garden. So we thought it would be minimal impact, and I'm sure we can relocate the trash, and we'll work with planning on this to resolve.
Okay, and the existing guest spaces in the center? I'm not clear how the doors of the cars are going to open, because those are only 9-foot space, and it appears there's a masonry wall around them. How will people be able to enter and exit their cars? I mean, 10 feet is considered standard for a space like that.
Well, 9 feet by 18 is regulation size, so we followed the regulation in terms of the parking space.
Okay. So help me understand these roof projections. You're saying that there's going to be no covering over the stairs?
Right, there's no covering.
So when it rains, and the rain runs
Down.
down the stairs
Yes.
into the master bedroom, how does that work?
There's a door, basically a glass patio door from the master level out into the stairwell, and that entire area is waterproofed. So it's a Dexatex frame.
Well,
Yes, of course. So it's on the master level, and the interior is a piece of roof, essentially. We have a roof landing and then an exterior stair starting from the inside of the project.
Okay. So, but there's still projections in your elevations that project into the vertical space.
There are only the railings.
So all of these projections, I'm looking at the top of, on A3.0. It's hard to tell how high that is because you don't have the elevation levels. It stops at the roof at 42, and then there's what appears to be another 10 feet of stuff on top of that, but there's no measurement on the drawings.
We have demising walls between the rooftop patios, and those are 6-foot walls.
So there's 6-foot walls, but then what is this thing that sticks out above that? This. If I'm looking at the east elevation on A3, there's what appear to be panels at a plus or minus the 6-foot height level, but then there's a projection above that for another couple feet.
No, it should only be the 6-foot walls. There are no other projections.
Because they're on every elevation. So I'm trying to understand what they are.
I'll look at that. I know it's one time there was a plan to have a kind of a shade structure, and I believe that that was taken away, but I'll confirm, and absolutely there are no plans for projections.
Because it's significant. I mean, it takes it up another 10 feet.
Well,
at
which is,
least.
we've worked hard to avoid and worked to make the building 42 feet instead of 45, and then to take off the stairwell. So that's contrary to our intent. We've been.
Okay. Back to the green point calculations. There's 5 points in your calculations for adding trees, 5 trees. But there are existing street trees. There's already at least 7 street trees there. So where are you proposing to add the 5 new trees?
We have a big tree in each front yard of the front units. That's something planning requested. So I believe we're having 2 trees in each front yard on the Detroit side, and we'll have trees in the rear yard as well. So we're not counting the street trees. The street trees on Detroit do need to be replaced.
Because I only see 2 trees in the front. I don't see in your landscape plans.
Right, not all the trees are rendered. We took at the request of planning, we took the trees off the rendering so they could see the building better.
what I'm saying is, in the rendering, it looks like within the property line, there are 1, 2, 3.
There's 7.
Because they're not on the landscape plan, and that was my concern.
Okay. I don't know.
Okay.
So, back to the rooftop projections. The counter, the sink, the barbecue, that's mass and a projection? And how is that being incorporated in the rooftop projections calculations?
So those areas are only 36 inches high, so there's nothing above that height. So there's no roof covering in that area.
Okay. I think that's it on my questions for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other commissioners have questions at this point of our applicant? Okay, in that case, you may be seated, and we'll ask the public to come forward. Again, I remind the public that you have 2 minutes to address the commission. First one is Michael Woltosevich. I'm sorry, Michael, if I... Wojtkiewicz. I should get that one right. Wojtkiewicz. Thank you, Michael.
So
After-
Michael Wojtkiewicz, again, City of Hypocrisy. Other literature that the city puts out is governance. And under the goals, there is ensure that the community is active, engaged in the decision-making process. In Goal 2, maintain transparency. The fact that demolition would happen within 2 weeks of this November 2nd meeting is highly troubling. The fact is, 1207 was a problem property. There are many such problem properties within this city. Its neighborhood captain, Mr. Hallman, never came to Public Safety Commission to speak about the urgency. If this blighted situation was so detrimental, the city should have taken action long ago. I occupied space next to 1207 Detroit as a gardener, so I know the truth. The city posts a notice, and then it does its sleight of hand and does something different. And I wanted to speak about that only, but then you have an architect show up, and they talk about the serene nature that they're trying to achieve. And they're doing that with 4 stories. You're going to see the garden from a distance. Well, you're going to have to be on the 2nd level of the Ralph's parking lot to see it from a distance. The green is so important, but yet we're asking for a reduction in front yard setback. It's ironic, it's hypocritical, it is par for the course that is West Hollywood.
Michael, excuse me, Michael. Since we have just a few speakers, if you'd like to take 3 minutes each, public speaker, if you'd like some more time, it's okay. Everybody will take 3 minutes.
Thank you.
You will?
Thank you.
Mike Carter, followed by Amber Coy.
Good evening. My name is Mike Carter. I'm a 30-year resident of Ogden Drive. This was the banner on 1207 North Detroit on October 22nd, and it wasn't factual, as it was telling us that we would discuss demolition on this site tonight. The opening line states a request to demolish. The building went down before the new truth was posted. And subsequent erroneous statements might cover for an overly enthusiastic developer, likely thirsty for small parcels of available land and not wanting to indulge the public's and the neighbors' not so feeble cries to preserve our green space and our neighborhood integrity. Moreover, though, my objection is that whosoever perpetrated this deed in effect robbed us of our voice here tonight in this matter, and we do not take lightly from anyone the violation of our right to speak on such issues. And we wonder why and what's next. Thank you.
Michael, could you allow us commissioners to see that posting that you had? If you give it to our secretary, he'll pass it around. Huh? I don't know either. Just look at it. I know, but the notice came in a different way. This is the notice for the meeting. I just want to see it. Just want to see it. Okay, thank you. Cynthia Blatt, followed by Sean Mims. Oh, excuse me, Amber. I'm sorry. I apologize.
Good evening, Commissioner, staff, and members of the public. I came tonight to represent newer residents of Detroit. I've lived on the street and in the city for about 3 years. I was excited and also a little bit saddened by the request for the public hearing. This is actually my first time attending a public hearing, mostly because the community garden means so much to me in that neighborhood. There aren't many spaces that are preserved and protected and have both access and participation by the community. There's a small roundabout which does lend great safety and intimacy to our environment. Across the street from the current public garden is a preschool. And so there is definitely for me a feeling of being intimate with my neighbors. My unit on the street doesn't actually have a fence around it. The projections for this new building are beautiful. I actually come from a design background, so I can definitely respect what Andrea has done here to design something great for the community, but I do see it more as a retraction from the access and participation and more of a way to provide very expensive housing in the neighborhood and to pretty much push out the people who have more of a stake in the overall community feel of the street. I don't know how much this is going to help in the hearing since one of the sites has already been demolished, but I hope that you will take into consideration varied perspectives present. Thank you.
Thank you. Cynthia Blatt, followed by Sean Mims.
Good evening. Cynthia Blatt, West Hollywood. I understand that this building is going to be built. However, to me, it seems like the city's continuing war on green space and open space. It was a community garden, and what's being destroyed is the last community garden in West Hollywood. I also understand that it was private property, which the city could have bought long ago if it had had an actual commitment to preserving green space, to providing seniors and neighbors and people with a serene area in which to plant. This is the last one, and it's gone. Also, as some of you know, in my job, I am a community planning and development representative with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, although I speak here tonight as a private person. And the point that I wanted to make about the notice of the demolition is significant because not only was that obviously not clear to the Commission, but it's a violation of our right to speak on an issue before it's demolished. That's the purpose of public hearing. And it also appears that part of what was in the staff report differs from what the developer said. So all in all, I wonder about the legitimacy of having a public hearing at this time when there are changes that we were unable to prepare for and staff was unable to answer. So, I just wanted to note that. And I wish the city had bought that property. It would have showed maybe a little less arrogance and a little less hypocrisy, but that wasn't to be the case. I also wanted to say that staff did say that over the past year, there were many complaints, there were problems, there were public, what did she say? Public health, safety, and welfare. It was a public health, safety, and welfare hazard for a year. But they waited until a notice of public hearing was posted and then demolished it as if all of a sudden this became noticed by everybody. But if it was there for a year, why wasn't it demolished 6 months ago or a year ago or at some point so that the public could have had an opportunity to know what was going on with this last piece of green space that the city's left to us? I also want to say that I agreed with what Stephanie Harker said earlier about the loss of the city that we have lived in for so long. And I was struck when the architect talked about the ability to put in an elevator. Rich much? You know what it costs to put in an elevator if the owners of these units wanted to put in an elevator? Well, I guess we could call it a shaft. Over the last year, oh no wait, I'm sorry. Give back the garden. The developer also said that the green space on the roof was to give back the garden. I don't see how that's possible. I do see my time's up though, so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stephanie Harker will be after Sean.
Hi, good evening, Commissioners. My name is Sean Mims. I currently own the property directly across the street on Detroit at 1206 North Detroit. I have lived either on Formosa or Detroit since September of 2000. I'm very familiar with the neighborhood, with the residents, and what I would like to see across the street for me, and I certainly don't plan on selling my home anytime soon. Having said that, I support the project. I'm happy with the design. There have been some questions regarding the integrity of, let's say, the safety issues or the interest of the occupant or the owner taking care of that. There have been some challenges. I don't necessarily, I don't blame the owner so much as I do the city of West Hollywood. If 90 phone calls were made to the city of West Hollywood, 88 of them probably came from me. I take care of an 88-year-old man. I'm his caregiver. And I was very concerned with the safety issue. I think that in the future, if I may say, separating from this project, I would love to see the city reconsider the requirements that developers have to secure properties. How are they secured and when are they secured? Regarding this project, I believe the applicant's asking for a setback request, modification. I support that. I literally live 20, 25 feet out from the front door of this property. I don't see the difference between 16 and a half or even 15 to 17 or 18. Regarding the community garden, if the city of West Hollywood, or more importantly, the residents, require or request community gardens, I think that's a very legitimate request and concern. I would certainly support that. But this property was on the market for 6 months prior to Mr. Soleimani's purchase. And I would have certainly supported the city buying that property and maintaining it as a garden, but it is private property. And I'm very excited to see the investment on my street. And I'm very excited for this project to continue. And basically, just to wrap it up, I do support the applicant's request for the setback modification. Quite frankly, I wouldn't have a problem with it being at 15 feet, and I don't understand why it isn't. But I'll leave that up to the experts. But thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephanie Harker, then followed by Kathy Blavis.
Hello again, Stephanie Harker, City of West Hollywood. I can't really pass my phone around, but I have a comparison of the first banner and the second banner. The second banner just has whited out the request to discuss the request for demolition. I think what concerns most of us is the process and the fact that it seems to change at will, the will of the city and not the will of the people. A neighbor of this project who referred to remain anonymous was told by the city when she called that she would not be allowed to discuss the demolition at this hearing because it was no longer relevant. And that the building had been demolished because it was a public nuisance. But I had heard that it was over 90 calls, complaints to the sheriff. Sheriff had been sent out many times because people were breaching the fence. And it seems to me that we really need to rely on code compliance to secure these buildings. They can be secured so no one can get into them. Just like the dog and cat hospital, the Streamline Moderne, where a fire broke out and someone was killed. They need to be secured. But that being said, this is about this new design. And I recall coming in front of this commission and listening to a design and a presentation not unlike this, where what you all have read and had is not what you are seeing, or not what has been ultimately being presented to you. And I would ask that you continue this to another date until what you're presented is what's actually going to be constructed, because I think it's kind of a waste of everybody's time to say, oh, well, No, we're not doing that anymore, but that's what you're looking at. So I'm wondering how you can make an educated decision on it if you don't have what's actually being built. Thank you.
Bright lights. Good evening. Kathy Blavis, City of West Hollywood. Again, we're here tonight to discuss the design, but we can't help but talk about how the demolition came about. I get noticed. I guess I'm within 500 feet, or maybe because I'm a neighborhood watch captain, but I got a notice that this hearing tonight was for the demolition. And I never got another notice that said, due to unforeseen circumstances or the fact that the building was unsafe. So again, as Stephanie said, the community has a problem with the process. And I suppose had some sort of notification gone out the same way notification came out about this meeting, that the building was going to be demolished before the meeting, it would be a different story. We probably wouldn't be talking about it tonight. I agree with Sean Nims that I think there needs to be very strict, something from the city about how to secure vacant buildings. There was a building on my block. The difference between mine and this is mine wasn't being demolished for a project. The property was in probate or something. It took 10 years before we finally got some boards on that building. And fortunately for us, the property was sold, it was rehabilitated, and it's three units now. One of the things that strikes me, and this is not the architect's fault, it's not anyone's fault per se, but the 10% reduction in part is due because of the security. You can't have a front porch, you can't have an open space area, you can't have benches because it's an unsafe area, and yet you're going to be selling luxury condos. I mean, it just makes no sense to me. It just makes no sense. So these are things that concern me. I don't really have much of a comment on the design because I believe the young lady, Amber, stated something that is at the crux of how I feel. We're losing any sense of community. This is a done deal in terms that something will be built here. And it is a shame the city didn't buy this property. You still could have built something next door where the house was demolished. We're losing that sense of community. And especially, again, going back to the lack of a setback, lack of benches, there's no, unless somebody has a dog and they're walking their dog, it's the only way you get to kind of meet your neighbors. So again, I'm concerned about how the process came down, and I'm concerned about our losing our community, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Matt Dennison, I believe, is our last speaker. Matt? Public speaker, I should say.
Good evening, Matt Dubin, West Hollywood. I am echoing what started with Mr. Vojkolevich and continued through nearly every speaker who got up here, which is to say that the noticing and the subsequent demolition prior to this hearing are really, truly problematic. And what you see in the community is a small but vigilant group of people who keep an eye out for what's happening in this city. And what I would ask everyone on this side to think about is that we want and expect you to be equally vigilant and make sure that the public's opinions, needs, and wants are heard and acted upon. And when things like this happen, where there's a notice that says there's a hearing about a demolition, and then a week before there's a demolition, that, the optics of that are terrible, and the feeling of the community is that you're not being as vigilant as we are. So I would ask everyone to consider that, and thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to close that part. Rebuttal, yes. I'm going to ask for the rebuttal now at this time. There's no other public speakers at this time. You want to come forward again, our architect?
I just wanted to say few things very quickly. I apologize, it is 21 parking spaces. We've gone through a lot of parking counts, but we'll absolutely work with the city on that. I wanted to show you, Lynn, there are no roof projections. And those are the 6-foot walls between, rising walls between the roof.
Take the microphone, please.
Those are the 6-foot walls between the roof gardens, but there is no projection off of them. There's nothing that goes in a horizontal direction from those.
The vertical.
There's a vertical that goes.
When you're looking at the building, the perception is that it's 54 feet tall.
It's, well, yeah, 50, but it's less. We've been slowly taking it down with each planning meeting. Removing the stair towers was a huge change in the mass, and we've made this a thin wall, and it is inset from the perimeter.
Because to me, the issue is not even the roof of the projection. The issue with the projection is the elevation, because that is what the perception of the size of the building is from the vertical projection, not any rooftop projection on top of that, because I don't have a helicopter. I walk by this, I'm looking at that projection, I'm not looking at the roof.
Yep, from the street view, as you can see here, those are not apparent because they're pushed in from the side, and you're looking up at the building. So we have studied the street views, as you can see in the rendering. So that's a flat view, so that's a view that you can't ever have unless you're on the Ralph's parking lot. I wanted to make another quick point about this notion of garden. We do have planting in front of the sidewalk fence. We did push the fence back. We know that it's a concern with dog walkers, and that to have 2 people walking side by side on the sidewalk is important. We also have filled the yards with plantings rather than have. And we also have planting at every level. So every place that we have a balcony, we've had added green all over the skin of this building. So I think maybe that wasn't clear. The garden is not only on the roof, but it's meant to cover the sides as well and occupy not only the front yard, but in front of the fence as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Altschul. I'm going to close the public hearing at this point, and the commissioners will deliberate and ask questions if you have them. Commissioner Altschul.
There's been a lot of talk about what was and what the city stands for. And I just want to throw in a couple of minutes about the fact that the city stands for today what it stood for at incorporation. It's a totally different economy, and things have not stood still. Things have moved forward. However, the city's commitment to affordable housing and to maintaining as much affordable housing as it can, despite the fact, or because of the fact, that because of its location and because of its extraordinarily successful attempt at delivering goods, services, and public benefit to its residents, it's become a very desirable place to live and to create more housing. The census shows that the difference in population between incorporation and this particular era is not very much, but the need regionally, nationally actually, but especially in the Southern California region for more housing is critical. And West Hollywood, as noted by an action, or rather a non-action of the United States Supreme Court this week, has remained consistent to its desire for affordable housing. If I'm correct in my number, and if I'm not, it's not far off. When you discuss Avalon Bay, I believe, has 72 affordable units on site. This is probably the most important public benefit that they delivered. Yes, I believe that the citizens who pointed out that there are an awful lot of unrented units, even though they say they're 80% rented, are probably correct. That's something that is a very big problem, and I suspect the only way they're going to be able to deal with it is to lower the rents. But I think the economic hit will sink in at some point, and probably not in the too distant future. that such a thing will probably happen. The United States Supreme Court refused to hear a case brought by some developers in West Hollywood who developed some property on Croft, just below Melrose. And it's already been developed because they paid all their fees that they had to pay, including some $540,000 worth of in lieu fees for affordable housing. They paid it under protest and went to court to say that it was an illegal thing that we had in assessing affordable housing fees and affordable housing requirements. It went up through the local courts, the state courts, and went to the Supreme Court on appeal. And in all cases, I believe the West Hollywood city's affordable housing statutes were upheld. The Supreme Court this past week, I believe it was, said that they would not take the case up for review, which means West Hollywood's affordable housing statutes and requirements are still the law of the city and what's going to happen continually here with respect to development. We also still have our rent stabilization laws, which give as much protection as we can possibly give to the residents that have been here since 1984 and the residents that have moved into rent-stabilized units after that date and continue to live in stabilized units. There is a tremendous commitment to the core values of this city on behalf of those of us that are sitting here, the people that you have elected to the city council, and the economics of development and the economics of life are something that we can't control. We have a tremendous increase in homelessness, which is extremely unfortunate. It needs to be dealt with, not only locally, but regionally. The entire housing situation needs to be dealt with. For many, many years, this commission and the city government has been trying to encourage development on the east side of units that will be individually owned, i.e. condominiums. I think this goes that direction, and it's a very desirable thing to have people own their own residences. I think the fact that there are some inconsistencies in the presentation of the renderings and the presentation of the application is certainly not intentional, or I don't believe it's intentional, but I believe it should certainly be straightened out. I think that, first of all, let me ask a question. Lori, who owns this property?
I believe the property owner is here, Mr. Soleimani.
Thank you. That being brought forth, whoever owns it filed an application which apparently, and again, if the renderings and the drawings, the final renderings and the drawings do in fact meet what's in the written word, in other words, if the presentation of the project is consistent with the written word, the model, and the renderings, it basically, with the exception of the front yard setback, meets code. And therefore, it's kind of an entitled thing on behalf of the applicant, with the exception of the modification, which is, now everything is discretionary, but it's basically the modification that is the only thing that is the subject of required discussion and final voting on. I think it's a very nicely designed unit, but I do think this matter should be continued to a date as soon as possible so that the applicant can get their act together and get what is being presented visually and what is being presented actually and in writing is in fact the same.
Commissioner Jones?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you. No worries. You can just call me Stacy. It's fine. So just because this is the first that any of us are hearing about the fact that there was a demolition that happened before it was noticed. Can you just briefly like explain what the situation is? Because I'm not up to speed, and I don't imagine that most of the people sitting up here are either.
So the sign has to be noticed on the property a minimum of 28 days prior to the hearing date. So the sign was posted on the property at the beginning of October, and then the demolition permit was issued at the end of October. And as soon as that demolition permit was issued, per the building division, we asked the applicant to please put up a sign that just said that the building was demolished because of a public nuisance. And then we asked them to cross out just the portion of demolition. So because that was no longer part of this project before you tonight.
Okay.
But that doesn't explain why the demolition permit was granted.
Right. I mean, I think
This
people are
hearing.
understandably upset because they were not noticed in advance of the actual day that it was demolished, and that the notice did say, I mean, it does seem a little disingenuous, and I'm not pointing any fingers, but that it would be like whited out after it was demolished, or like the day that it was
Well,
demolished.
all notices for any project
They say demolish.
request to demolish and to build.
Right, but still, I mean, that's still the only information that people in the community have to go off of. So I just want to understand what
What
like,
happened?
Yeah.
Why?
Okay, Lauren?
Sure, let me just add a little bit. In Exhibit D to the staff report, there's a letter that the building official wrote to the property owner declaring it a public nuisance, listing the reasons and ordering the property owner to receive building department demolition permits, which are different from the planning discretionary development permits that you normally review at this body. And the letter says that the building has to be demolished within 90 days from the date of this notice. So upon receipt of this letter, the building owner applied for building permits to demolish the property.
Who signed the letter?
Cynthia Zabala, the acting building official. It is unfortunate, and I hear everything that the residents have said. Around the same time, the planning department sent out a notice saying the planning commission is going to be hearing an application on demolition, development permit, and modification. And so there was understandable confusion in the community why a notice would go out saying that there's going to be a demolition permit and then the building be demolished the next day.
And
But,
also, Lauren, isn't it the case that buildings are not allowed to be demolished until an entitlement is granted? Is that correct?
Yes, and that is why the application for development included a request for demolition permit.
Which they all do.
Which they all do, because we don't want buildings demolished and lots to sit vacant. We want them to come with a plan to develop. So you get both of those discretionary planning permits at the same time normally, which is what the applicant applied for. There was this unusual and intervening circumstance that while the application is being processed and before it came to you, the building was deemed a public nuisance because of all the safety issues happening there and structural damage. There was structural damage to the building if you read the letter, and the building official declared it a public nuisance. So these two things were happening at different
I get
times.
it.
Okay.
I understand. I just, unless it's like you can't know what you don't know.
Yes.
I mean, it's just for people who have come here tonight. There's no way for them to have known that Mr. Soleimani got a letter from the city.
Understood.
And it sounds like this was issued on September 12th. It looks like the letter.
Or 19th.
19th. So I mean, in theory, you could have waited until after the hearing. I'm just saying.
Completely understood. And as Lori mentioned, he was directed to put a notice up explaining what happened. I don't know if that...
But did that not transpire?
I'm sorry, did what not transpire?
Did he put the notice up?
A notice up?
Yes, he put the notice up as soon as he received demolition permits.
The notice that he was ordered by the city to demolish
It's
the
a-
building because it was a nuisance?
Yes, that's exactly what the sign that's right next to the public hearing sign, 3 feet by 4 feet. We asked him to make it big, so it was exactly the same size as the original sign, just to let everybody know, give warning that the property was going to be demolished.
Buried the lead. Okay, that's good to know. I didn't know that. Again, unless we hear from you or we have some other way of finding out, like, we don't know. I live at Laurel and between Sunset and Fountain. I'm not, I have a full-time job. I'm not like walking around the city. If you need to get in touch with us to tell us about this stuff, please contact us. That's really incredibly helpful. I have other comments, but I'm just saying, like, I kind of have to take everybody at their word because I don't live on that block. I'm not, I'm not going by day to day.
So, I was actually contacted by citizens regarding this issue at the time that it happened. And I had a couple of questions. We have other vacant properties that are properly secured. And yet this one, for some unknown reason, was unable to be properly secured. I feel very uncomfortable with effectively rewarding a developer for abdicating their responsibilities regarding the security of the property and then turning around and saying, oh, well, we'll just demo it for you, no problem. When all the other developers are properly securing their properties and following the protocols that are expected of them. How do we promote a culture of compliance in this city if we say, oh, well, never mind, you don't have to follow the rules, we'll just let you demo your building early days and never mind the public notice process? This is very concerning to me, and from a Brown Act and from a noticing process, we sent out a public notice to the citizens of our city saying we are going to have a hearing about a demolition, and then literally I receive an email on a Sunday with pictures of a bulldozer on a Saturday. Another issue, this bulldozing happened on a Saturday, okay, from a permit issued on a Friday. Now, there's multiple compliance issues here, and we seem to be rewarding it, and I've got grave concerns about that.
I would like to respond to that.
Okay. Also, this discussion should be about this particular project, not general things. It's important, but perhaps we could do that at Commissioner comments at the end. Thank you.
If I could respond to Commissioner Hoopengardner's comment, I had extensive conversations with the Building and Safety Division, the Code Compliance Division, as well as the Sheriff's Division, and they said that the owner has diligently always responded immediately to putting boards up, boarded buildings, boarding all the walls, all the openings on the property, and the same night, the homeless people taking over the property would rip them down. The owner would go up immediately after, board them up again to the satisfaction, sheriff and code compliance would be on site. So I don't think it's anything that the property owner didn't do. I think they did their due diligence according to city staff in trying to secure the building as best they could. I think it was just a very problematic site. One thing I do also want to say about the demolition permit, it was issued on Friday, and I have talked to two adjacent neighbors, and they said there was absolutely no demolition on Saturday or Sunday. They demolished the building on Friday, and what was left of the building, they demolished, picked it back up on Monday. So that was two adjacent neighbors that I spoke to after we heard word that there was potential construction on the weekend, and they said absolutely there was no construction or demolition on the weekend.
Thank you. Commissioner Altschul.
I think there's so much fuzziness here that it needs a little bit of step back to see what actually happened. The fact that this became a critical situation within 30 days, literally, of this particular hearing, where the demolition was supposed to be discussed and evaluated, it leads me to believe that we need to look at it a little closer. An alternative to immediate demolition could have been that the applicant be ordered to provide security guards on a 24-hour basis. There are other kinds of remedies that can be done rather than allow an applicant to have a demolition circumventing the code process. So I would like to, and since there are other things that are not in full alignment with the moon and the stars here, I would like to see this matter continued. In fact, we'll make a motion to continue it to resolve whatever issues the commission decides needs resolving, and then come back to decide whether or not the entitlement should go forth. It's discretionary.
So I'll just kind of reiterate a little bit more on what Lori had indicated. So, some people were concerned that if there had been so many complaints, why didn't we require the building to be demolished earlier? So it is only at the very last resort that the city would ever order a property owner to demolish their property. That's a really significant thing for the city government to tell someone to demolish their property. That's really significant. And so our code compliance division had been working with this property owner for quite some time. As Laura indicated, the sheriff's department, the fire department, they had all been working with this property owner, trying to get this property secured and maintained. And every time they did that, people would still get into the property and still break in and still cause problems and still cause the building to start to deteriorate further. And so at a certain point, city staff had to say, we've tried every opportunity, and I believe security guards had actually been tried. What's last can we do? And yes, we understood that, yes, it is really awkward that it's happening right now at the same time this development application is coming through. But our primary concern is the safety of individuals, not just the neighbors, but the safety of people who are breaking into this building and trying to live in the building. And so we want to make sure it's a safe place for everybody. And if it's a nuisance for the homeless folks that are living in the building, we want to make sure that doesn't happen, that they don't inadvertently set a fire or do something or cause the building to collapse and cause physical harm to people. And so that's why the only way we can get around our normal code requirement is an exception in the rules specifically for when the building official determines the building is a nuisance and a hazard to life and liberty, to
Was
life.
consideration given to requiring the owner to post 24-hour security, since it was so close to the particular hearing?
So I
that had been
don't
publicly
remember off
noticed?
the top of my head if that had already happened. I know they had code compliance had tried everything they could to try to permanently secure the
I think
facility.
we need to know it for sure.
Right.
Well, could you address that, the applicant?
For 3 weeks, there were armed security guards 24 hours a day.
And I have a concern too, that when we actually, if we were to approve this and he gets his permit, how are you going to secure it while they're building it? Because there's a building, it's going up, all these homeless people could just go in and stay there until the walls and locks are on there.
Isn't that a concern with every project?
Yeah, but particularly apparently in this area.
I understand, but I mean, it's...
I have a question about the security guard, just for clarification. Was that post receiving this letter or pre-receiving this letter?
Sure, please do.
I think that makes a difference.
Good evening, Madam Chairwoman, everybody.
Would you state your name, please?
Yeah,
sir?
my name is Michael Soleimani, for the record. From the day that we purchased this property, we have secured it to the fullest extent. I'm talking about 2x4s, lag bolted into windows. We had actual metal protectors over these windows. I don't know if you've seen some of the older homes where they have metal over every window. We had wood and metal on top of it. I was dealing with this on a daily basis. I would actually show up to the property almost every single day. Even with lag bolts put all the way in, the people that were coming to the property nightly, which I saw on a first-name basis, I've seen the sheriffs arrest the same people 20 times. I mean, I don't know how many times different officers begged me, aside from the neighbors that lived in the building next door that were absolutely terrorized, writing letters to the city begging for the demolition. We did everything in our power, and I take my responsibility to the neighborhood extremely importantly, and we did everything we could in our power to secure this property. We did not want to pay a security guard for 24-hour security. It was an unforeseen, unbelievable cost, and yet we still did it. Every single time we would do something, by the end of it, we found out that the people that were breaking in actually had tools. I would find drills that were used to re-drill places. Every day I would see different people, and it's sad to see people with drug problems in there. I would walk the property, there would be needles everywhere. Just such an unsafe place. I mean, something like you've never seen in this city. And I think part of it is due to how close this property is in proximity to La Brea and the issues we have on Lexington coming westward towards West Hollywood, but we did not want to demolish this building. In fact, as developers, just to make it clear, it is a lot more expensive to demolish a building and then come back and grade that building and excavate. It's far more of a simple process for everyone involved to
I appreciate
wait.
your answer, and I hate to cut you off, but I asked, did you post the security guard before or after receiving this letter?
Yes, we had a security guard before the letter, and we also had the security guard up until the final moments that it was demolished.
Because you got the letter in September.
In September.
And you demolished it, about a week ago?
Yes, after going through.
There's more than 3 weeks there, but you only had a security guard for 3 weeks. So was it just every once in a while you would have a security guard? Or was it, what 3-week period?
So the 3-week period in between the demolition and the notice, there was a full 24-hour armed security guard. So they would come and they'd make, different shifts every 24 hours. And even when we had armed security, we were still facing problems because people were
I'm just not feeling
jumping.
like I'm getting a straight answer.
No,
I'm sorry to be so direct with you, but
Sure.
when did you start posting the 24-hour security guard? Before you received this letter or after you received
So
the
we
letter?
had tried 24-hour security way back in the day prior to us working with code compliance every single day on this issue. Then once we had gotten the letter, at that point, code compliance had emailed us that it is a requirement that we have 24-hour armed security. And then from that moment forward, we had 24-hour armed security. Prior to that...
Okay, thank you very much. I was not with you, Commissioner Altschul, on the ambiguity of these answers until now, but I believe I'm with you on your motion at this point. That's all
Jeff
I have.
Hobble, Jeff Jones, all of the code compliance come out daily with the sheriffs as well. Thank you.
So there's a motion on the table.
Well, I'd like to,
Is there some second?
Yeah, Adam, Commissioner Bass just seconded it.
Okay,
Wasn't my intention, but I'd be happy to second that, yeah.
okay.
but I think there's a couple of other issues that need addressing as part of this continuance, because I would agree with the continuance, but I think that there are a number of other things that need to be addressed related to that. Needless to say, the parking is one of them. But I have a very real concern about this project fundamentally not being in compliance with the intent of our zoning. We, in the general plan process, added additional heights to different zones to provide for more housing. So when we said you can build to 4 stories, the intent was to build 4 stories worth of housing. And this project does not do that. This project has the parking on the ground floor. Back to Commissioner Cavaliero's regular point about activating this space. This is not active space. There's no active ground floor at all.
I think that's discussion about the entitlement, which is not on the floor now.
Well, but if we're going to continue this, to have the things, to have various items addressed, to me, this is one of them, including the fact that it's a ground floor parking with a bathroom.
But we don't have the final presentation of an application, in my opinion.
Don't you think it would be appropriate for them to address these things before they come back?
It would be appropriate for staff to discuss that with them, and perhaps for you to discuss it with staff before staff discusses it with them, but it's not.
So we don't get to express our concerns?
You can do, I would suggest you do it with staff, and let staff.
Well, but I
do it.
think this is a public hearing and it should be a public process.
But you can do it.
It's not an issue.
You can do it. You can do it in general terms rather than in specific terms, so as not to violate what is before us at the particular time.
And this project is before us at this particular time, and this project has ground floor parking.
The subject is the motion,
The
not the
subject is
project.
the motion now. It's procedural. If you want to discuss it, then
I
then
think that
don't-
it should definitely be
don't
looked at,
vote in
all of
favor
the
of the
things
motion. It'll
that
fail.
are not in sync on the renderings with the verbal, with the model, and with the staff report. And
And
that
s-
covers an awful lot.
And including the fact that the setbacks are not done accurately for the balconies.
That the renderings, the verbal, the staff report, and the model are not all in sync with each other. And they need to be explained or brought into sync with each other so that they're correct.
Okay.
Okay. It's been, motion's on the table and it's been seconded. Any comment as to the motion itself? No more comments on the motion, so we'll vote on the motion.
So are we continuing this item to a date certain?
The motion did not carry.
And the motion on the floor fails.
So now we can still discuss it, and we can decide whether, huh?
And we could revisit.
Or you could do another motion. You could make a new motion.
So to continue the discussion, I am very perplexed as to these balconies that all encroach into the setback by an amount that's not really specified on the plans, but appears to be a balcony's width of 2 or 3 feet. And this is on all 4 sides of the project. In our ordinances, balcony projections are allowed into setbacks up to 24 inches above the first floor, open and unenclosed by other than railings. Table 3.2. These are completely enclosed balconies, sides, ceilings, etc., which visually creates a larger project than is allowed per the setbacks, per the zoning. And I'm not sure how this is being presented by staff as not requiring a variance, because it substantially increases the size of the project and encroaches into these setbacks.
Lori, do you have a comment on that?
We'll look into that and work with the applicant.
So, in addition,
This would be
I
picked
get
up at
why there's
Kokomo's, right?
bathrooms on the ground floor in the garage, because we have a requirement that there be ground floor accessible bathroom facilities. But as a project and as a potential person being asked to spend a great deal of money for these townhomes, if I have any guests that can't handle the stairs, I can invite them over, invite them to use my bathroom, and then send them on their way, because they can't come into my home.
So then people don't.
There is no ground floor living space. There is no accessible living space. And to put a bathroom in a garage so that you have a bathroom on a ground floor, yes, it complies with the letter of the law, but certainly not the intent of the law. And so back to the conversation about continuing this, I think that that in and of itself is, we talk about this almost every project, aging in place. How on earth are you going to age in place in this space? And then we get into more things that you can't back up out of 2 of the spaces because the walls are in the way. There's just a ton of different design issues that I feel need to be addressed, and I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Jones.
This project is, at least based on my review of it, legal. It's barely legal. I'm going to say, too, that this really isn't the time or the place, but I think it warrants mentioning. I'm not going to base my vote on this. I don't know why anybody would want to live in a 4-story, 1-bedroom condo. That's point 1. Point 2, the closets in some of these 2 bedrooms are literally 9 square feet. No. Sorry. That does not pass muster. And I understand that there's a 90% minimum density, they've built it out. I understand it's not built out to the full, extent that it could be, but do I think this is the best project that it could be? No, I don't. But please keep in mind that based on, court precedent in the state of California and the, Housing Accountability Act, neighborhood compatibility for purely residential projects is actually not a criteria on which we can vote. I just want to make that known. I don't know. I have a lot of kind of comments and questions about this. I mean, I suppose legally I could get behind this vote, but I don't feel good about it. That's all I'm going to say about it. And I'm just going to say, I know that bringing, kind of the plan check process is very intense, but it's only fair that we see plans that, as best they can, reflect the project that is in front of us. I do not like reviewing projects that do not have the project, at least as it's currently proposed, especially with the parking situation. I'm very hesitant to make a decision that I can feel confident in making tonight, just on that basis alone. And again, I'm going to leave the design comments, I'm stating them for public record. It's something that really would be more appropriate for design review, but no one else has said anything about it, so I'm going to say it. That's all I have at this time.
Other comments? Rogerio? No? Adam?
I want to say I was content with continuing this, but before that motion was on the table, my thoughts on this are that I don't believe that there's any sort of conspiracy at City Hall with the demolition. I just don't. I don't buy into that, but I do buy into what Mr. Dennison said, and that is the optics are bad. The optics alone are enough to concern me. And so if we do continue this ultimately, I would like to just kind of see what that process was so that it's a little bit more straightforward. Securing buildings is not before us, and I recognize that, but I want to acknowledge that I hear what was said about this. I live at 1000 North Ogden, and at 1021 North Ogden, there was a building that for a long period of time was not secured. Homeless people broke into it. It was a home. They caught it on fire one time. They tore down the fence for a bonfire in the backyard. I mean, it's an issue that our city needs to address, and maybe that we can explore that more. But I want to acknowledge I hear that, and I've lived through that myself, and I know that's a serious issue. Overall, this project, I believe there's really only one issue before us, and that's the modification of the setback. And I haven't really heard any opposition to that, and I personally don't have any opposition to that. So with that being the only discretionary item before us, it would make this a pretty straightforward vote. But I don't believe we have a complete packet that gives us a full understanding of what's here, so I'm content continuing it. But I do want to acknowledge, and the applicant said this in her comments, she and I had a telephone conversation about the fence, and I would like to see this revisited without the 6-foot fence and without the 4-foot fence that they originally proposed. And in my experience, and all of you who've been on this commission for a while know that I've stood before you and made this comment about other projects, that when you build a fence around one of these properties, you deactivate the street, and that's where a lot of folks go. So when you have those fences, you're actually creating more of the problem, taking eyes off of the street that are creating the problem right now. So I would much prefer this project, and I would, without a fence around it. Right now, you're building a wall around this building.
I would.
Yes.
So, I'm not going to reiterate everything everyone has said. I agree that the optics are bad. I think, I don't think there's a conspiracy at City Hall. Having gone through the planning process and the building and safety process in the city, I understand that, there are two different tracks. So I get that. I do feel that the applicant should get all their ducks in the row, so I would support a continuance. And I agree with Commissioner Bass with respect to a 6-foot fence or a 4-foot fence. The reason a lot of these places feel so closed off and not safe is because we kind of perpetuate that, with the high fences. So I support Commissioner Bass's recommendation with respect to that, if the applicant would consider it. So I think Commissioner Hoopengarner, you're making a motion for a continuance?
I'd like to move for a continuance, and I would encourage staff to work on their housekeeping. Things like hedges that are going to be required in 7.14, but yet there's no hedges. Talking about urban amenities that aren't identified, et cetera. I think there needs to be a considerable amount of housekeeping on the package as well as from the applicant and the architect. So I would move that we continue this until such time as those items are addressed.
I'll second the motion.
Okay, and before we vote, I think one of our other commissioners would like to speak.
Yeah, I want to make a comment about the fencing or the wall that's around the perimeter. I've been an advocate for that open space so that you have sort of interaction with the units on the lower level. What I'm worried about in this situation is that the designer has provided a green band around the building, which makes for a great sidewalk experience. If we allow this building to go forward without that fence or wall, there's nothing to keep the occupant, or once the building is built, to go over the counter and pull a permit and build a wall on the property line that's 3'6". And then we're stuck with a wall and no green space. So I just offer caution around that one, because right now what they've proposed is something that is workable and can be a nice experience along the sidewalk, and what we could end up with is the exact opposite. So, and I do agree, I was ready to move this project forward. I don't see, when I look at the property lines, I don't see the balconies projecting beyond 2 feet over the property line. I like that the designer has stepped the glass back. I like that.
It's into the setback, not over the property line. Into the required setback, not over the property line.
Okay. I like that the designer has set all the glass on the balconies back, so you don't get a full wall kind of effect. You don't get this sort of oppressive feeling as you're walking down the street. When you're walking down the street, you have perspective, so those 6-foot walls that are up on the upper floor are not in your line of sight, so it's not going to feel like this big block wall. It seems like the intent was, the parking intent is clearly presented in A2.5, and unfortunately, A 1.0 conflicts that. And if we removed A 1.0, removed that parking space, we probably wouldn't have a conflict because they've already reduced the number of units so that parking would be in line with the number of units. So it's, again, it's a one-day exercise, a half-day exercise that staff can do to bring that into alignment. I don't have an issue with a 10% allotment of the front yard, because some people were saying that it's arbitrary or had sort of different points of view as to how you come about that. That front yard setback is an average of all the setbacks in the front. And I totally support the idea that setback, that 10% setback or 10% reduction on the front yard setback is contingent on 1221's building or not building, because if that project doesn't go through, then this project will seem awkward. But if that project does go through, this will be awkward. But if it doesn't go through, then this will be in complete alignment with everything else on the street, maintaining the neighborhood fabric. So I don't have an issue with that, but I definitely want to maintain that contingency on 1221 Detroit and what happens on that project. Those are my comments. Yeah.
Okay, any other comments? No? I do have a comment. I think my thinking is consistent with Commissioner Caballero. I don't see the real value in continuing this project. I think that the issues that were brought up, the inconsistencies, are things that our staff can deal with, and when the final plans come, the actual building plans, again, these plans are for design. They aren't detailed, and both the building art department and the building and safety is going to be looking at code compliance issues, and they will not be approving plans unless those are consistent with code. So I don't see the value in continuing this for these reasons. So I would be opposed to a continuance. So I would, the motion is for a continuance, or what is the motion, Commissioner Hoopenhoek? For continuance?
For continuance to correct all of the items identified.
Okay. So we'll take a vote now.
Commissioner Elcho? Thank you. And the motion passes. 5 ayes, 2 noes.
Karen, can I take a 5-minute break?
5-minute break. Thank you.
I guess he kind of didn't.
we're going to convene the rest of our meeting. I would invite the members of our public to stay because we're going to be discussing the process and how things go through the planning process. So it might be interesting for you guys. And I would invite you to stay. We'd like you to. Thank you. So you could do that too. Because of course we tape this. Okay. Thank you very much for being here. Okay, we're going on to new business, which is a training for our commission regarding the planning review process. And I believe our acting director is going to be conducting this little training.
Thank you, Chair and members of the commission. Again, it's John Kehoe. And we're going to just have another brief session on training and just a little bit more training for the commission as we have a little bit of time tonight. So we had gone over previously kind of the big picture overall of the process for the planning process, from planning to building to construction of buildings. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit more about how to make findings. You know, we present resolutions to the commission and they have all these findings in it. And the resolutions also have conditions of approval. So we're going to talk tonight a little bit about making the findings and then what do conditions of approval mean. So first I wanted to just make sure to remind the commission that we have two types of projects that we review in the planning department, and those are ministerial permits and discretionary permits. Ministerial permits are projects that come in that the city either says yes or no to. It either complies or it doesn't comply. We don't make findings because it complies, and we can't condition it. So a typical thing like that might be a fence on a residential house. They would come to the planning counter, they would draw a plan, they would show the fence, we would look at it, make sure it meets the height requirements, meets the setback requirements, and then we stamp it approved because it met all the requirements. And we can't condition it to say, we're approving this because it's painted blue. We can't condition it to be painted blue because that's a condition, and this is a ministerial permit, and so it's approved because it complies. The other type are discretionary permits, and discretionary permits are where the decision authority has the discretion to look at it, to decide whether or not it meets all the findings that are set forth in the zoning ordinance. So you have to go through all the findings, criteria, and see if you think it meets all those criteria. And then if need be, we can make conditions of approval and saying, we're going to approve this subject to X, Y, and Z. And so that may be something that's already on the plan, so we make sure that it stays like that, or it might be something that's not on the plan that when they get to building and safety, they need to revise the project to make sure it meets a certain condition of approval. So what we're going to talk about tonight are the discretionary permits and the findings that need to be made, and then conditions of approval. And I think Lauren is going to go next.
And so I will take it from there, just to talk a little bit of the legal requirements for why we make findings. Except I can't get this. Oh, there we go. Okay. So the importance of making findings. Findings are important when you as a body perform a quasi-judicial function. That means when you're reviewing these permits, you're actually sitting as a judge would do in a courtroom. And you're looking at a particular land use entitlement, such as a variance or a conditional use permit, and you're judging whether it's appropriate for a particular piece of property. Findings are the most important part of your decision-making. What they are, and what the courts have said, is that they're legally relevant sub-conclusions, which expose your analysis of the facts, the regulations, and all the city's policies, and the key term is that they bridge the analytical gap between the data, all of the evidence before you, and your ultimate decision. They're the bridge that show us how you got there. Stated another way, they're legal footprints that city officials leave to explain how you progress from the facts through the standards to your decision. Oh, I keep hitting the wrong button, sorry. So findings have four purposes. Two are related to your decision making, and two are related to if your decision is challenged in court and a judge is looking at it. So the four purposes of findings are: one, they provide a framework for making your decision, and they enhance the integrity of the administrative process because everyone knows what you're going to be looking at when you look at these particular projects. 2, they help you make your analysis in an orderly fashion and reduce the likelihood that the agency will randomly leap from evidence to conclusion without explaining how you got there. And then in the event that someone decides to challenge the city's decision, it helps them determine whether or not they want to challenge a decision and seek judicial review and remedy. And it tells the court the basis for how you made your decision, because remember that the judge isn't here, so the judge needs a written statement of how you made your decision to review whether it was appropriate or not. So when are findings required? State law has not clearly distinguished the situations which require findings and which do not. So unless there's a specific statute which tells us you have to make them, we look to the courts to tell us and case law to tell us when they're necessary. So for the most part, case law has required findings for land use decisions that are adjudicative when you're sitting as a judge. In this type of decision, you're holding a hearing, you're taking your evidence, and you're basing your decision on that evidence. The action involves a fixed rule, so we have our zoning code rules, standard or law, and you're applying it to a specific parcel of land. Again, variances, use permits, and subdivision maps. By way of comparison, findings are not typically required for legislative acts unless a statute specifically says you have to do it. In contrast to those adjudicative acts, legislative acts are when you're formulating your rules. You're making your policies for the city. You're deciding how big buildings should be across the board, what standards apply in which zones. Those are legislative acts, and other than determining that they're consistent with your general plan, you don't need findings. There are other statutes that require specific findings, such as if you're adopting a growth-limiting general plan or a growth-limiting zoning ordinance. And of course, as we talked about in the last training, CEQA has very specific situations when you need to make specific findings. So your findings are always going to be based on evidence, and that's substantial evidence. The best definition I've ever found of substantial evidence actually comes from CEQA, and it's when you have enough relevant information and reasonable inferences from this information that a fair argument can be made to support your conclusion, even if another conclusion could be reached. So you're looking at facts, you're looking at reasonable assumptions based on facts, and expert opinions supported by facts. You're not going to rely on things that are pure argument, speculation, unsubstantiated opinions, or inaccurate information. Oh, let me go back. There we go. So just a couple final thoughts on findings before I turn it over to Jennifer. We all know, as we saw tonight, you're asked to make really hard decisions up here. And so one way we like to term it is that land use decisions can have rough edges. You can hear neighbors talk about economic impacts to their property and neighborhood conflicts. There can be political pressures. There's all kinds of rough edges and hard choices that you have to make. But when you focus on the findings as an integral part of your decision-making process, it may not guarantee that all those rough edges get worked out, but it can reduce the public's doubts about the wisdom of your decision, and it reduces public skepticism about what your motivations are. You explained very clearly how this project meets the codes and meets the policies. You connected the dots from A to B to C, and it just reduces skepticism about motivation and your decision. It also builds an excellent defense if the city attorney's office has to defend your decision, because we have a wonderful written record of why you made your decisions, and it serves the public purpose best for regulating land use. Jennifer is going to talk to you a little bit about the specific findings in our code for specific permits.
Thank you, Lauren. So go ahead. Thank you. So I'm going to go through 3 of our most common land use entitlements that require findings, and sort of talk a little bit about the specific findings. There are some that you find that come up in many different entitlement processes, and those are the ones that are the most basic, like does it meet the zoning ordinance? Does it meet the municipal code? Is it consistent with our general plan? Can it be conditioned so as not to endanger, jeopardize, or otherwise constitute a menace to the public convenience, health, interest, safety, or general welfare of persons residing or working in the neighborhood? One of the things that you see in development permit findings that kind of makes it different from others, and you find this also in the administrative permit, which also deals with construction and with aesthetics in some ways, is the finding D, which is a new structure is compatible with the scale, bulk, and mass of existing structures in the vicinity of the subject property and does not impair the integrity and character of the zoning district in which it is to be located. And we have specifically intended this to not be that it has to be consistent with the architecture, it doesn't have to look the same as everything else, but generally it fits in the scale, bulk, and mass of what else is there in the vicinity. So that's in a nutshell the development permit findings.
And also on that one, also what is allowed in the zoning district, because it's talking about the character of the zoning district.
Right, of the district itself, in addition to what's already there, but also what we have envisioned to be there in the future in our general plan. Can you go? The next one I'd like to bring up as an example is a conditional use permit. So this, where the development permit is to build something, to develop something on a site, this is to use the site in a certain way. And conditional use permits have been determined to be required for uses that generally can be allowed in the zone and can be appropriate, but that we need to condition, that we need to make sure that we're looking at a little bit more closely. So there are certain uses that we allow in the code without a conditional use permit. So for instance, you can have a restaurant without getting a conditional use permit, but if you want to have alcohol at that restaurant, now we want to have a little more scrutiny on there, and we want to make sure that it's more appropriate. So we require a conditional use permit actually for a restaurant with alcohol. It's a minor conditional use permit, but the findings are the same. So again, we have, does it meet the zoning ordinance and the municipal code? Again, we have, is it consistent with the general plan or specific plan? But then we have some extras that are more specific to the conditional use permit, which is the site physically adequate for the type, density, and intensity of the use being proposed? So this is, who's going to be there? How are they going to be using the site? What kind of utilities are we going to need for this use? And so we can dig a little bit deeper into the actual operations of the use and whether it's appropriate there. We also talk about in letter D the operational characteristics of the proposed use. So how is this use going to carry out? What are the hours of operation? What are there going to be customers coming? Or is it going to be an office where, or I guess an office isn't a CUP, but how does it function? And is that something that is compatible with other land uses in the area? So an example is one that you heard a few months back for a daycare in a specific location that the Planning Commission found ultimately was not compatible with the surrounding land uses, and that was the finding there. And then again, does not endanger, jeopardize, or otherwise constitute a menace, another standard condition. So those are the conditional use permit findings sort of in a nutshell. And finally, the variance findings. So variance is a specific case that the findings are a little more stringent. So what we're looking for when someone requests to go beyond or outside the zoning ordinance and request something, we want to make sure that first and foremost that there's something extraordinary going on with the property itself, not what they're putting on it necessarily, but the size, shape, topography, location, or surroundings of the property itself that would cause a hardship for this particular property does not apply to other properties in the vicinity that are in the same zone and otherwise have the same situation. So one of the classic examples is you have a certain setback, but your property has a giant boulder right in the middle of it. So you need to build maybe closer to one lot line or the other. That's a situation, that's an obvious situation for a variance, but it helps in your mind to understand that it's something about the property and it's something physical. Also, we want to make sure when we're looking at variance findings that that we're looking at a substantial property right situation. So it's because of the circumstances or conditions, the variance is necessary for preservation and enjoyment of a substantial property right possessed by the other properties in similar situated. So it's a similar thing where you have something very specific about the property doesn't apply to other properties, but it has to involve a substantial property right. So if that boulder's there, they couldn't, and they had to strictly adhere to their setbacks, maybe they couldn't build their house at all, and that is considered, developing your property is considered to be a substantial property right. And also, and then we have that it's not materially detrimental to the public welfare. Again, that you see that repeat with not detrimental to the welfare, and that it does not adversely affect the general plan or the purpose, intent of the zoning ordinance. Obviously, in this case, we can't make a finding that it's consistent with the zoning ordinance because by definition it isn't, but we want to make sure that it is still consistent with the purpose and intent of the provisions of the zoning ordinance. So we're not giving a variance that's going to be for something way out of the question in terms of what the general plan and the zoning ordinance have envisioned for the site.
So we're now going to move on to conditions of approval because those were the findings, and you heard in that some of them talked about, and the project can be conditioned. So the zoning ordinance does specifically state that we can add conditions of approval. In particular, it says, in approving a development permit, the review authority may require alterations to the proposed plans and may impose reasonable and necessary specific design, locational, and operational conditions relating to both on and off-site improvements. So again, that's letting you know that you can see a project before you and you can approve it and condition it to have the design change and say, we're approving this project. However, we're going to condition it to remove this design feature, or we want a new design feature added, and then it's still approved with that condition of approval, and then it goes on to building and safety when that condition is then applied. The conditions can talk about ensuring that the site is physically adequate for the density and intensity. We can add conditions to make sure that the operating characteristics of the use are appropriate for that zone. We can ensure that they have adequate on and off-site improvements such as fire hydrants or street lights. We can require conditions about maintaining scale, bulk, and mass of properties. That's one that we've dealt with on many occasions. We can require conditions that incorporate landscaping elements that contribute to landscaping and improve the landscaping of the area. And then we can also require conditions regarding the maintenance and operation of the actual use itself. So those are the general broad categories. And so Jennifer's now going to talk about how we have traditionally applied those in the resolutions that come before you.
Actually, I'll go first.
Lauren's going to start that. Okay.
Okay, well, John sort of explained the purpose of conditions, which are to make sure the uses are compatible and do not create negative land use impacts. The law surrounding conditions of approval is pretty well settled, and it can be summed up in two rules, pretty much. One, if you're going to impose a condition on a project, there has to be a nexus. Conditions must be reasonably related to the impacts that are generated by the project. So that means that the condition is related to the nature of the project or the activity. And two, the condition has to be roughly proportional. So it's proportionate to address the impact generated by the project. So this has to do with the extent of the condition. How much are you asking for? So every time you think about whether you want to condition a project, you think, is there a nexus between the project and the impact? And is it roughly proportional? It's an old case, but probably one of the most famous cases about conditioning a project is the Dolan case, where the applicant asked to increase the size of his plumbing store and his parking lot. The city required the applicant to dedicate 15 feet within the floodplain for drainage and another 15 feet for the bike path. There were some questions as to whether or not that was even related to the expansion of the plumbing store and the parking lot, and the court said, even if you can articulate a nexus, it's not roughly proportional to the impacts that are caused by expanding your retail store and a little bit of the parking lot. Essentially, the city asked for too much in relationship to the impact that a plumbing store and a parking lot could create. So that it's just kind of a basic example. I'm sure all the lawyers on this commission learned about this case in law school. But it's just a good example of how to apply the nexus and the rough proportionality rule. 4 questions to ask when you're thinking about doing conditions, and these were actually from the League of California Cities and a land use training that they did that I thought were very helpful. The questions to ask are: 1, what is the impact that the project will create? Does the proposed condition serve a legitimate public interest? What is the relationship between the impact of the development and the condition? How do they relate to one another? And are the impact and the condition on par with one another? So those are just the 4 questions that I would think to myself before proposing a condition on a project, to make sure that there's the connection and the proportionality that we're required to have under the law. And Jennifer just is going to tell you about the conditioning process.
So I just wanted to go through a little bit of the standard conditions and some of the tailored conditions that we put on our projects that we bring forward to you. This is a list of standard conditions that you often see at the beginning of the conditions section of a resolution. These categories are general, and these categories may all appear, they may not all appear, or there may be other ones. We start with a standard set and we tailor it down for the particular project, but it'll give us a good idea to go through the different types of conditions that we put on every project. So we start with, we have legal requirements. There's a lot of language that we have to put in to protect the city and to make sure that we have the blessing of our city attorney, and that we are, all have our ducks in a row in terms of all the legal requirements. Then we always have a project description. We always have somebody to tell us, we always have a description of what's being entitled very specifically so that there's no question. We also include in that section the expiration of the project, so we know how long is this entitlement valid. We also include fees. So there are exaction fees that we require of every project, and those depend on the type and size and what's going on. And so those fees are all memorialized there as well. And those are conditions of approval. Similarly, bonds, an applicant must post a bond to make sure that they do X, Y, Z, they finish their project, they do a study, whatever they need to do. Then we have demolition and construction conditions. These are generally put on in our DRC process that we talked about a couple of meetings ago. We talked about how we kind of go through the initial review with all of the different divisions, and then, we come to you guys and we get the entitlements, and then we go through with all the divisions again in concurrent plan check. So these conditions sort of bridge that gap between the initial review of all of the different divisions and then what they look at in plan check. So here we're going to see things like our construction period mitigation plan that we've talked about a lot, different types of public right-of-way improvements, what kind of recycling you have to do during demolition, construction, that kind of thing. Similarly, the building and safety and engineering conditions are the same type of thing. Landscaping conditions will memorialize what we require in the landscaping. Design requirements, again, memorialize what's on the plans. We also have on use permits. These are taken from a residential, residential project. In use permits, we also may have an operations section or an alcohol use section where we have all of the ABC requirements. We have a transportation, parking, and circulation. Again, that's where our transportation demand management program conditions go, as well as parking conditions. And then, if necessary, we'll have a seismic section. We also often put conditions in here with mitigation. If there's an environmental mitigation that needs to happen, that'll go in the conditions section. And also, whatever other various things come up. As I said, they're often very tailored to the project. There's a difference. So each condition is going to have, in addition to what Lauren has said about what we need to ask when we're looking at the conditions, we also want to make sure that we're having the condition memorialize who is going to be doing the action, what they're going to be doing, when they have to do it, and who's going to check it. So we have a certain sets of conditions that are like legal conditions that just kind of go in there, and it's just language that needs to be in there. There are certain conditions that have to happen prior to issuance of building permits. So we have to have something on the plan, or we have to have them submit a certain study or something like that prior to giving them their actual building permits. And then we know that we have to check all of those because it says that specific time. There are certain ones that need to happen prior to certificate of occupancy. So those are things that have to happen during the construction time of the project. And then especially for use permits, there are things that are ongoing in perpetuity for the life of the entitlement. So things like sound attenuation, or hours of operation, or how they operate their outdoor dining. Those are all going to continue on, they don't have an end date. So we need to make sure that we're really clear on when something has to happen, who's doing it, so it's clear that the applicant is doing something, or if the city has to do something, and then who's checking it. Is it to the satisfaction of the director? Is it something we have to bring back to a body, or is it something that the city engineer checks? You know, we want to make sure that we know who's responsible for checking that out. Did you have a question?
No,
Or
I
did
was
you have something to add?
I was just going to add that the conditions of operations can change. You know, sometimes other divisions have changed in how they operate or how they do things, and so they may say, we need to change a specific condition of operation because we now are doing something a different way, so we'll change the conditions in our template. Other times, the Planning Commission starts adding a condition continuously, and so we say, okay, it looks like this is now, either we decide it's really a regular condition of operation, or the Planning Commission asks that it becomes a regular condition of operation. Some recent changes that we've done over the last 3 or 4 years have to do with some construction mitigation measures that we've kind of beefed up over the years based on some comments from residents and from the commissioners. So those have changed. So these the standard conditions can change over time as new technology comes up, or we change our procedures, and so they can change. And then we create new ones, obviously, for specific things for individual projects. And I think that's what we wanted to present tonight. And if there's any questions, we'd be happy to.
Can I ask a question? I had some members of the public talk to me about a condition on Huntley, where they're building that just between Santa Monica and whatever that street, that east-west street, just further south. There's a big project going on that came before a commission. Apparently, the water table is very high there, and so whenever they're digging to do underground parking, they reach the water table, and then there's all this water that is coming out. And a couple of they've had a lot of projects on Huntley. Some of them have been conditioned where the construction contractor was required to have a tanker there to take the water out rather than let it run down the street. But apparently this project, water was running down the street, and for a while was just sitting there, and there was a mosquito problem. So when does it happen that you condition it where they have to, if there's a water table issue, that they have to pump the water and remove it, or just let it run down the street? Because it's happening like now.
Well, we can certainly look into that. I think I know the project that you're talking about. But in general, we have dewatering conditions in our standard conditions, and we require a geotechnical report that will often tell us what's going on underneath the property. That is sort of, while we review those things and coordinate that, it's not my area of expertise. So I know that we have conditions regarding dewatering that are standard from engineering, and for specific projects where we know that this will be encountered, we try to beef those up and make them a little bit more tailored, and certainly address the dewatering situation.
But I guess if a resident feels that there had been those conditions placed on it and they're not complying with it, then that's an instance in which
They
compliance
approached the contractors, some of the neighbors approached the contractor on that particular project, and he said the city did not require him to pump the water. And so
that would be something that, I'm not familiar with the
Yeah.
circumstance on this one, but if that's the case where they should contact the city to make sure that the city is saying that maybe they presented an alternative plan that reached the same conclusion. I don't know, but if they see that, they should contact code compliance.
Apparently, several neighbors did make that contact, but the contractor said that he wasn't required, so he didn't do anything about it. Anyway.
This was great, thank you. Could you email this to each of us, as well as the CEQA presentation that you did?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good. I think this is really helpful. But it's good to have it like in front of us when we've got these issues before us on certain items, that we can make sure that we're following along and doing our job. So thank you very much. So we'll go on then. Thank you for that. No unfinished business and no excluded consent. Items from staff, planning manager, do you have an update for us?
I can let you know what's coming up on the next agendas.
Okay. They're busy.
They're busy. They're very busy. And I think that goes into next year, but I only have this year's. We have the commission calendar dates coming up. We've got a project at 8116 Norton, that's 8-unit apartment building. 1227 Formosa, which is a 3-story, 5-unit condo building. 541 Norwich, which is a single-family dwelling with a variance, so that's why it's coming before you. Single-family dwellings don't normally. And a zone text amendment with respect to the multifamily zones. So that's going to be a full night. On November 30th, at our special meeting, we're going to revisit 8711 to 8713 Beverly, which is a project that came before the commission, I think in May, that was brought back. It was directed to redesign and come back, right? So it's next to the old Jerry's. And 7326 Santa Monica Boulevard, which is at Movietown. It's a pet boarding and grooming. 8462 Sunset Boulevard, which is changes to the Grafton Hotel's parking requirements. 1150 Orange Grove, which is a 5-unit condo, and public benefits policy. And then on the 7th, December 7th, we have an apartment building at 1257 Sweetser, apartment building at 933 Spalding, a tall wall at the Mondrian Hotel at 8440 Sunset, and then a 10-unit condo building on Ogden and Genesee.
So not much to do.
Not much.
Yeah, so make some time for reading.
Okay. Thank you so much. Any commissioner comments at this time? No? Yes?
No, I said probably skip public comment.
Yeah, public comment. No more public comment, excuse me. They went home to watch. Items from commissioners at this point? No? No?
Just one brief one. This particular package didn't have all the pieces, and importantly, it didn't have the green building calculations. And I would encourage staff to make sure that we have all the things that we need so that we can make the decision, because they're asking for a variance based upon the green points, so they have less open space. Well, we can't make that decision without that information. So for your previous packages have always had the green building points. This one didn't. I just want to make sure that we're consistent going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, good point. Any other comments? Okay, then without that, we'll adjourn to the next regularly scheduled meeting, which is Thursday, November 16th, here in our council chamber at 6:30 p.m. Thank you, everybody. Good night.